One of the most important jobs of leaders is to envision, lead, and deliver change. And yet, so many have little understanding of how to do exactly that. Many still believe that change starts with an intellectual leap, a big idea, and then requires sufficient power and persuasion to see it through when demonstrably it isn't working. For decades, the failure rate of change in all sectors, including the public sphere, is 70 to 80%. This represents trillions of dollars, pounds, yen, and euros being burnt. We don't accept that level of failure rate in other critical human activities. Would you, for example, have a hip replacement if there was more than a 70% failure rate? So why haven't we gotten better at change? Many leaders fall back on well-worn, lazy phrases about, well, it's just human nature, and you don't get to control all the variables. But should we accept that status quo as leaders? In this show, John talks to Greg Satell about his countercultural ideas about how the change industry needs to change. This is an important topic with powerful ideas to help leaders improve at one of their most critical responsibilities.
Welcome to the show, Greg. How are you feeling today?
Feeling fine, John. Good to see you. It's been a while since we saw each other in Austria.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing experience. We were at the 15 Seconds Festival together, and I had the challenge of going onto the main stage after Greg. Greg is a very big personality in lots of ways, physically, a very muscled, robust character, and a presence that is quite powerful. And you did an amazing talk and got a huge response from the audience. So I had to kind of follow that, which actually is really good because it just lifted my game as well. So thank you for that. And then we had some great conversations afterwards with our friend Aidan, who runs the Innovation Show,
who is a large personality himself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Large
so
person and large personality. Former professional rugby player.
Yeah. So the three of us had a great time, and then we carried on that conversation at the airport as well. So that was really good. So Greg, let's get you familiarized with our audience. Let's say we're at a dinner party, and someone you've just met asks you, who's not in a kind of related field, what do you do? How would you describe your work and the reason you do it to somebody who's not in the business world?
I help organizations work with transformation and change. And it's a deep, deep passion of mine because organizations have such a difficult time changing anything. And one of the examples I love to use is lean manufacturing. So lean manufacturing was a methodology that was first developed in the 1980s. And it works wonderfully. Everybody knows that if you implement a lean manufacturing program, it will lift your productivity, and in many cases, quite dramatically. But after 40 years now, adoption is stuck at around 10-15%. And this is not a new idea. It's for something that has a proven track record. And it's still incredibly hard to get implemented and adopted at scale. So there's so many new ideas all the time. But if we can even just get the old ideas adopted at scale, the ones we know work, we can make an incredible impact. And that should be doable, but it's actually much more difficult than most people imagine.
So you've been working on this topic for a long time, and you've got some big ideas that you have outlined in your work. One of them is that revolutions don't begin with a slogan, they begin with a cause. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to go back to the beginning of what is often called change management. And it's important to understand that change itself has changed a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. So back in the 70s, the vast majority of corporate assets, more than 80%, were tangible assets. So things like factory and equipment and real estate. But today that's completely flipped. And more than 80% of tangible assets are intangible. Things like patents and licenses and know-how and processes. And so when the process of change management first arose in the early 1980s, it was really designed to address that first type of change. There was somebody high up in the organization would make a decision about some strategic asset, like, I don't know, building a new factory or launching a new product line. And the practice of change management was really designed to communicate that change and help people understand it, embrace it, so that they could adopt it and make it their own. But if they didn't like the change, there wasn't really much they could do about it. I mean, if the boss says that they're building a factory, they're building a factory. If they're launching a new product line, they're launching a new product line. But today, when we talk about change, it almost always has to do with some intangible asset, and changes in the way people do things, changes in what they think and what they do every day. And people have an enormous capacity to resist that, and they often do. So if you're applying that old those old ideas about change management to the new type of change, it's not going to go very well. So change is no longer about persuasion. It's about influence. And we know that ideas about change are propagated socially through peer networks. So if you think that, through some wordsmithing and, a communication campaign, you're going to get people to change, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You need to make it, number one, you need to make it clear the cause, why people need to change. So no amount of wordsmithing or sloganeering or any sort of gimmicks is going to do that. You need to get out of the business of selling an idea and into the business of selling an actual success.
Right. So I see the truth of that because, working alongside large change and transformation programs, there's a disproportionate emphasis on change communications, and there's a whole industry around crafting that message. And I guess it's to your point, it's a very tangible thing that leaders can kind of hold on to as being, we've made this really clear now, and we just need to communicate it. And in many cases, that is counterproductive because it creates more of the resistance to change rather than bringing people with you. Can you talk about what's the alternative? What do we need to move past? How do we create this cause?
Well, if I can touch on that point about triggering resistance, we know, and there are, we have decades of research, hundreds of studies, and we know a lot about change. And one of the things that we know is that the tipping point for change is somewhere in between 10 and 20% for the vast majority of cases. That's the S-shaped curve that people often talk about. So we don't need to convince everybody all at once. We just need to get to that 10 to 20% tipping point. And I often laugh when you see these huge launch events, and they actually show the S-shaped curve. And it's like, well, if you know about it, why are you having this huge launch event, right? When you'd be much better off rather than having this huge launch event, which is likely to trigger resistance long before you reach that tipping point. If you focused on getting together a small group of people who believe in the change, who want it to work, and pursue what we call a keystone change, which is a clear and tangible goal that involves multiple stakeholders and will pave the way for future change. So it's not a quick and easy win, but it's some real tangible success that shows that the change, whatever it is, whether it's agile development or lean manufacturing or whatever, that shows it can work and produce results. And that's the way you can start bringing in other people who can bring in others still, and how you can build to that 10 to 20% tipping point.
Can you give us an example of where you've seen that really working? Because that resonates with me hugely, this idea of creating a tipping point rather than trying to convince the whole organization. I've seen that myself. But can you give us an example where you've seen that really powerfully work?
Sure. So I'll give you two examples because one I found out after the fact, and the second is from a recent project I worked on. So there was a guy at Procter and Gamble. He was in his mid-30s, a guy named John Gadsby, and really middle of the middle management. So there's this myth that change always has to come from the top, which really isn't true. And he had solved a problem. I'm still not exactly clear on what problem he solved. Apparently it's some super secret, but he won a big award from the CTO. I think it was called a Pathfinder Award. And he essentially took a process that took weeks, and he brought it down to a matter of hours. And he told the CTO, hey, I can do this across the company. I can apply the same principles that I use to solve this problem to solve lots of other problems. And he launched this movement for process improvement across the company, and he got essentially a year to prove this out. And he started going around the world to different innovation centers and starting programs at innovation centers across the world. And as they started to pick up wins, it picked up steam. And I think within 18 months, this had grown to 2,500 people. And within and today, I think it's 4 or 5 years into it, because as luck would have it, as soon as he got the green light to get this award, my book Cascades came out, and he used that as a model. But today, it's this PXG program in Procter and Gamble has grown to more than 60,000. And it started off very, very slow. And in the first 6 months or something, it was only, a handful of people. But that's how things grow. And then I recently was doing some work with a mid-sized city in America, and they wanted to roll out a program to the throughout the city government. It was about 2,500 employees, and they wanted to start with the 40 directors, and that was going to be their initial group. And I asked them, well, what if you started with 12? And at first they became a little bit nervous, and they said, well, wouldn't that slow us down? And I said, well, how many of the 40 do you think would be enthusiastic about the change? And they said, well, maybe half. And the way they said maybe half made me think it was more like a third. And I said, well, what if you started with just 12? And they said, could you find 12 who'd be enthusiastic? And they said, oh, yeah, of course. And they immediately started coming up with names of people. And I said, and if you run into a problem with the training, what's going to happen with the 40? And they said, oh, well, people start complaining and undermining. And I said, and if you run into a problem with the 12, what's going to happen? Oh, they'll just push through it. And I said, well, and then what do you think the 12 will say about the training? Oh, they'll be really enthusiastic about it and say how great it is. And I said, well, don't you think that's worth the 90 days to start with the 12? And within 5 minutes, they realized that it's going to be a whole lot easier to start with the people who are enthusiastic and pick up the wins and learn from whatever the problems are, and then roll it out to the next 40, and certainly worth the 90 days. Nothing slows you down faster than failure.
I mean, you're backing success rather than trying to prove why it's not going to work.
Yes, it's a really good point. I mean, the urge to persuade is usually a red flag. It means you have the wrong change or the wrong people.
I love the sentiment that you have in the book around a movement without values is nothing more than a mob. Can you talk to us about why change and values are so important?
Because values are constraints. So my favorite example of this is Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement, because throughout his career, throughout his life, people called him all sorts of nasty things like communist and anarchist and extremist. And he always had the same answer, that he said, nobody needs to guess what my values are. They were all written down in 1955 in a document called the Freedom Charter. And his organization, the African National Congress, they invited 300 or so groups to contribute to this document, which they called the Freedom Charter, and Nelson Mandela would later say that if his organization, the African National Congress, had written it themselves, it would have been very different, but it wouldn't have been nearly as powerful, because values represent costs. And one of the things we do when we work with organizations, we ask them what their values are, and they always say things like, well, we value the customer, we value excellence. And then we ask them what those values cost you, because if the values don't come with costs and constraints, it's not a value. It's just a platitude. A great example of how this works out in the business world is Lou Gerstner's turnaround at IBM, where he said, we're going to get back to valuing the customer. And he also made it quite clear that they were willing to forego revenue on every sale. Because before Gerstner got there, if you had one non-IBM piece of equipment in an entire data center, they would threaten to cancel your contract. He stopped that. And I've interviewed dozens of executives from that period at IBM. And every single one of them points to not only Gerstner's focus on the customer, but the fact that he was willing to forego revenue on every sale as probably the biggest reason IBM is still in business, because without that, it wouldn't have any credibility. So this signaling of willing to incur costs and constraints, that's what makes the change. That's what makes the the effort credible and believable. If you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to be explicit about what your values are and be clear about what costs and constraints you're willing to endure to enforce those values, then it's really just a bunch of stuff that you want. It's not really something serious.
So, Greg, this observation about what's missing in the nature, the spirit of change leadership is really interesting, because I do see, a disproportionate emphasis on the clarity of change, the to from explanation, the honing of messages, and then the maniacal move to let's get it done through, a PMO and process and over communication and so on. So why do leaders avoid the this values-based conversation? Because it's so intrinsically important to helping people to make sense of things.
Yeah, because values come with costs and constraints.
Yeah.
It's easy to say you value the customer, but and when we work with organizations and we sit in workshops with them and we say, what's your values? Oh, we value this, we value that, we value excellence, we value the customer. And then you ask, what do those values cost you? How do they constrain you? And that becomes a very, very different conversation, because it's easy to say you value something, but if you're not willing to incur costs and constraints, it's not a value. It's just platitude. It's just something you say. And I'd go back to Lou Gerstner's turnaround of IBM, where when he was a customer, he was furious that because they installed one piece of competing equipment, IBM was threatened to shut down his entire data center, which would have had an enormous impact on his business. Does that show you value the customer? So when Lou Gerstner said, we're going to get back to valuing the customer, and that means that we're going to shift from our proprietary stack of technologies to the customer's stack of business processes. And we're willing to forego revenue on every sale to make sure we're delivering the best solution for the customer. And he proved that he meant it. It's just dramatic when you talk to anybody who worked in IBM at that time, what a shift it was. And nobody thinks IBM would have survived without that. So being able to say, these are our values and this is what we're willing to sacrifice for them, that's a hard thing to do. It requires you to really commit and to give something up. It's easy to say that there's a bunch of stuff you want. To say there's some things that you're going to deny yourself, well, that's much harder.
I love that. So you say we should resist the urge to engage those who attack and undermine us. Can you talk to us about that?
So there is a very strange quirk in human nature that whenever we're passionate about something, we want to go convince the skeptics. We want to find the people who hate the idea and try and convince them. And that's almost never a good idea. Chances are it's going to just frustrate and exhaust you. And that's energy that you can put into helping people who like the idea succeed, to empower them to create that first keystone change so that they can bring others in who can bring in others still, and eventually get to that 10 to 20% tipping point. And one exercise I often suggest for people is to think about this situation. So you're in a conference room and somebody proposes an idea, and over the next hour it's discussed, and certain objections are brought up and addressed. And as you're coming to the end of the meeting and going to next steps. Somebody who hadn't said a word the entire time throws a hissy fit and completely discredits themselves. I mean, have you ever experienced that?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So think about why it happens, right? Somebody, that person, when the idea was proposed, they had such a visceral reaction that they couldn't even articulate why they liked it, why they objected to it. Usually, it had something to do with some sort of memory. We know that our amygdala, the emotional part of our brain, is tightly linked to the hippocampus. So when we're, and we often have this in our close relationships or family, where something triggers us, but it's not, and people look at us and they say, well, why did you have that reaction? And we're not actually reacting to the present state, but something in the past that it triggered. Anyway, they had this triggering reaction, and they couldn't articulate it, which is why they didn't say anything the entire meeting. And it was only going to next steps that triggered them. So there's a bunch of stuff we can learn from this. First of all, people are going to react to change in that way. There's always going to be some people who aren't going to like it for reasons of identity, dignity, and sense of self. And you can ask people to change what they think or do, but you can't ask them to change who they think they are. The second thing is that it was the initial success that triggered them. So we often think that once we get that first success, we get, a budget for our initiative or executive sponsorship, that everything's going to be downhill after that. But it's usually the opposite. Usually it gets harder because now people can see that it's possible. And the third is that once they had the hissy fit, they completely discredited themselves, and they completely lost their power to make any serious objection. So, and this is something that I talk about when I talk to transformation and change professionals. When I mention this, I always get people who come up to me afterwards, because if you're gaining traction, the people who oppose the change will, as long as you don't engage with them, they will lash out and they will overreach and they will discredit themselves, as long as you don't engage. So, and whenever I speak to transformation and change professionals, they always say, I always get people coming up to me and saying, oh, I thought that was something special that happened in our case. I didn't know that was a regular thing, but it very much is a regular thing.
Yeah. So really what you're talking about here is some deep counterintuitive emotional response that you have to try and develop in order
Identity is a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that every objection is like that. One of the first things we do when we sit down with an organization to talk about change is go through a resistance inventory. And we've categorized five reasons people resist change. One is lack of trust. There's change fatigue. There's competing incentives or commitments. And then there is switching costs. And those are all completely rational reasons why people would resist change. And then you need to build strategies to mitigate each of them. But then there's the last category, the resistance related to identity or dignity or sense of self. And you're always going to get some of that, no matter what it is. And simply knowing it's there, and not, understanding that resistance to change doesn't always have to have a reason. uh, it 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 can help you a lot, because then you just know that it's there, and you can focus on more productive aspects of how you can bring the change about, rather than trying to convince people who are never going to be convinced.
Yeah. Yes, I guess what I was driving at is that you have to try and you've helpfully here tried to make a distinction between the logical debate and the value-based debate. You know, my value versus your value, my identity versus your identity, which is not a productive conversation, and is often you feel compelled to enter into it because you're confusing whether it's a logical answer versus what you're talking about. So that's super helpful to make that distinction.
Well,
Um,
if I can stop you there, because I think you touched on a really, really important point. I think values are a little bit different than identities.
Well, when I use the word value, I use the word value just rather than values, and I meant your sense of value, which is
Right,
tied
right.
deeply into your
Your sense
identity.
of self.
Yes.
But still, it's a very important point about values, because there's two different kinds of values when it comes to change. There's differentiating values and shared values. So the example I love to use is the Agile Manifesto. So anybody who comes back from an Agile training loves to talk about the Agile Manifesto. And those are differentiating values. And when people feel passionate about an idea, they want to talk about the differentiating values, why their idea is different, because that's what makes them so passionate. And people like to talk about their passion. But if you want to bring other people in, you need to focus on shared values. So not the Agile Manifesto, but better projects done faster and cheaper. And making that shift is surprisingly easy. And again, in workshops, when we mention it, people say, "Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense." And they don't have a problem doing it. And just because you're leading with your shared values, just because you're talking about better projects done faster and cheaper, doesn't mean that you're foregoing or obscuring or forgetting the Agile Manifesto. It's just you're building a bridge, so people can get from point A to point B rather than just starting with point B.
That's a really great distinction. So one of the ways in which you think about operationalizing building support throughout the organization, and this idea of cascading the change, is about focusing on building local majorities. And again, it's another version of not fighting the resistance, but actually building the movement. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, there's a very, very famous series of experiments done by a psychologist named Solomon Asch, where they brought people into the room and they showed them these two cards, and they asked, it was a very simple exercise of asking which line on the right best matched the line on the left. And as they went around the room, the first 7 people all gave the same wrong answer, until they got to the last one, who was the only real subject. The others were, of course, Confederates. And the vast majority of the time, they all gave, they conformed to the majority opinion, even if it was obviously wrong. And most of the issues we deal with are somewhat less clear than the length of lines sitting right next to each other. More recent research by Nicholas Christakis has shown that this effect goes to three degrees of relationship. So not only our friends and the friends of our friends, but the friends of our friends' friends affect what we think and what we do, even for things like smoking and obesity. So the best in research study after research study shows that the best indicator of what we think and do is what the people around us think and do. So you want to start with a majority. If you start you can always expand a majority out, even if it's 3 people in a room of 5. But as soon as you're in the minority, so 2 people in a room of 5 rather than 3, you're going to feel immediate pushback. So that simple principle of always starting with the majority, it doesn't need to be unanimous, but at least a majority, can be incredibly helpful in how you're sequencing change. So think about that compared to traditional change management, where you're trying to communicate to the entire organization this change at once, where you're triggering those people who aren't going to like the change, who have some sort of identity issue and have this visceral reaction to it, and you're triggering that response before you hit that 10 to 20% tipping point. And then this other approach where you start with 3 people in a room of 5 and you get to work on a keystone change, and you start with people who are enthusiastic and you're not bothering with those other people, then you can keep expanding until you hit that tipping point, and your chances of success are going to be obviously much better.
So let's just pause here for a moment, because you have given us an awful lot to think about. And if I was a change leader in any kind of industry, you've already probably overturned a number of my key assumptions about how I do things, and how I approach things. What kind of reactions do you get from people when you are sitting down with them and having these conversations? What's the kind of aha moments for them? What's the internal journey they have to go through, their own resistance to their received wisdom about how this works?
Well, I have to say, not so much the people that I work with, because the people that I work with are kind of already, self-selecting. Right?
They're drinking from the Kool-Aid already.
To a certain extent. And they have some uneasiness, which I'll get to in a second. But generally speaking, when I say that, which is so obviously true, that whenever you ask people to change what they think or what they do, there's always going to be people who resist it, and they're going to do it in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. People have a real problem with that, which is strange, because we all do that. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but people seem to think that that's kind of blaming or something, when actually it's just human nature. And I see it as completely the opposite, putting the burden on the people who want to change, who want to push change, and saying, no, they have to persuade everybody else. It's on them. I mean, that's a terrible burden. And when we work with people and they hear that you don't have to persuade everybody all at once, you can feel like a collective, everybody's sort of breathing out, because especially when people have an idea for change, it's something they're quite passionate about. And to tell them that they need to take this idea that they feel so strongly about, and the burden's on them to convince everybody that that they should change, that's a very, very heavy burden. And change isn't gymnastics, right? You don't get extra points for making it more difficult on yourself.
Yeah.
Right. But I would say that the people that we do work with, there is, again, because people who start change initiatives tend to be enthusiastic, the pushback we tend to get is they want to go faster, and we keep telling them to go slower. With the Keystone change, what we keep asking is, how can we make it smaller? And then usually they come up with a proposal. We ask them, how can we make it smaller? And then they say, it usually takes a couple of iterations to where we can get to the smallest possible, most reducible element. And that takes a little bit of adjusting.
So what Scott and I are seeing all the time in our conversations with leaders and in the work we do is that change is, for most leaders, this side gig. They've got to deliver value today. They've got to deliver the short term. And at the side of their peripheral vision, they've got this huge transformational effort that's going on. And frankly, most of them feel completely out of the depth. The expectation of more for less has gone into hyperdrive, and people are exhausted and overwhelmed. How do we manage the change challenge with people burning out and routinely feeling they've got more work than they can possibly do?
It's a great point, because the research is very, very clear that even before the pandemic, that change fatigue is enormous and real. PwC had a study which showed that 2/3 of employees are experiencing some form of change fatigue. So the first thing I would say is change is not always a good thing. You know, you need to to start an initiative is the easiest thing in the world, but you need to be very, very disciplined about the change that you pursue. You can't change everything all the time. So the first thing I would say is less initiatives, and see them through. There is so that's the first thing. The second thing is limiting the size of your initiative. Starting slower with less people, and proving it out that makes it less stressful, right? Because if you're starting an initiative with a handful of people, then it's not such a big deal, especially if those people are enthusiastic and they're going to push through any sort of glitches or snafus, and they're going to fix problems on the fly. That's very, very difficult to do if you're starting with an enormous organization-wide initiative, which is really just an idea. And maybe you can point to some success in other organizations or other contexts, but people within the organization haven't seen it. That's very, very different than something that's already been successful in the organization. And lastly, I think that managers need to understand that the changemaker mindset is different from the manager mindset. When we're managing operations, we need to focus on consensus and predictability and execution. A changemaker mindset focuses on coalition building, because there is no consensus about a change. It's something new. Uncertainty, it's not going to be predictable. You haven't done it before. And exploration, because you can't just execute something that you haven't done before. Now, effective leaders need to manage both mindsets. And just because you're pursuing change doesn't mean you can abandon the managing mindset. We still need to run everyday operations. But if you try to pursue change with a manager mindset, with this idea that we need to build consensus and everybody needs to be on board from the beginning, you will fail. And that becomes very, very stressful. This idea that everybody needs to buy into your idea from the start, that's inherently stressful. And that you need to convince people. You need to go to where the energy is. You can't try and create and maintain it all by yourself.
So you've got your idea of minimal keystone change. Try to keep it as small as possible. How do you scale that idea successfully once you've established the proof and you've got a coalition of like-minded people who are really behind this? How do you get it into the organization at scale?
So scaling isn't that difficult. Traditional things like Yammer groups or newsletters, or once you've built that success. But there's one strategy in particular that we find especially helpful, and we call it a co-optable resource. So asking yourself, what resource can you give to people that will help them co-opt this initiative for their own reasons, which might be different than yours? My favorite example of this is TEDx. So if you think about it, TEDx there's 14,000 of these events around the world every year. People don't get paid for putting them on. In fact, they're not allowed to profit for them. But they're all promoting the TED conference, which of course benefits TED. But they're not doing it for the sake of TED. They're doing it for their own reasons. So another an example within an organization that I like a lot is when Experian, when they were shifting from on-premise computing to the cloud. One of the things they did is they set up an API Center of Excellence. So it was a resource that product managers could co-opt, could help them solve their problems and help them create cloud-based products for free. And it was just something that they could use for their own purposes. So whenever you give people, you put resources in their hands that can help push the initiative forward, that helps them further their own goals. That's really super helpful, and much more than sort of some sort of mandate or carrots and sticks.
You talk about the victory phase being the most dangerous point of the change journey. Talk to us about that.
Right. So we were talking about the situation in the conference room. If you start with that initial group and you get that keystone change and people see that the program is gaining traction, that's when and people see that change is possible. That's when you're going to get the most fierce resistance. And we certainly saw that in Ukraine in 2004, which is why there needed to be another revolution in 2014. But we see it all the time that once people get that initial win, that executive sponsorship or the budget being approved, that's when people start working to undermine the initiative, and you have to be aware of that. Very, very often people get that initial backing and they think, well, now it's just about execution. But what tends to happen is very much like the conference room example. People keep their composure, they don't have the hissy fit, and they just go out of the room and start sabotaging it in the hallways. And if you don't understand that's going on, what's going to happen is 6 to 12 months later, you'll realize that you've been quietly undermined the entire time. And once you get to that point, it's very, very hard to recover.
Greg, as we start bringing the year to the close and we think about what's coming next, can you give us a final kind of thought to inspire change makers about how they can lead into the future more effectively?
I would go back to my comment about that you don't need to put change all on your shoulders. You don't need to create the energy yourself. You need to go to where the energy is. Go to people who actually want change to happen, who are ready to embrace change, and use them to build to that 10 to 20% tipping point that can actually trigger a cascade that leads to that exponential acceleration. Before that point, you need to be very, very protective. But once you get to that point, change becomes inevitable. And I can tell you this, and John, you know a little bit about my background. Change can happen in even the most unlikely places. And change is always possible, even in the most dire circumstances. So don't lose faith. Just focus on what you can change in front of you, and the larger changes will come.
That's a lovely place to leave it. What's next for you? What are you looking forward to in the new year?
I'm just, and as I think I mentioned in the beginning, I'm just so passionate about this because we know that all too often change fails. We know that roughly 3/4 of transformational initiatives fail, and they don't have to. And we really can make an impact. So that's what I'm looking forward to, is helping people to make the impacts that they want to see.
Brilliant. Greg, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know our listeners are going to get a tremendous amount from this and very practical way of thinking about change differently. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, John.